be endurance training. These are adaptations to endurance training. They are not adaptations to resistance training. That will come later. Okay, this table is only reflecting adaptations to endurance training, meaning if you were to run 4 days a week over a period of, let's say, a year, how would your body be different after that year of endurance training than it was before? Okay, so when we look at these variables, specifically the submax variables, we're not looking at what happens to the trained person when they start exercising. Okay, because when the trained person starts exercising, the trained person were to go for a run, their body is going to respond the same way that the untrained person is. Okay, so all of this, what happens with increasing exercise intensity, this applies to a trained person and an untrained person. Their body will respond to exercise in the same way. Their heart rate's going to go up, their stroke volume's going to go up, heart rate output's going to go up. It's all going to be the same responses. Okay? When we're looking at with training, we're going to say we're going to take the trained person and the untrained person, both exercising at the same intensity. So the example I'll use most of the time is they're both jogging at 5 miles per hour on a treadmill. How does the trained person's heart rate compare to the untrained person's heart rate if they're both exercising at the same intensity? How does their stroke volume compare? How does their AVO2 difference compare? How does their blood pH compare? So we're going to be looking at these different concepts, comparing the trained person to the untrained person. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay. It'll be more clear as we go along, and I start giving examples. Okay, so we're going to start with resting heart rate. Trained person, how does a trained person's resting heart rate compare to an untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same? Lower. Okay, so I'm going to put a down arrow here. It's important to understand that this does not mean that their resting heart rate is decreasing. It means their resting heart rate is lower than an untrained person. So if it's less confusing for you, you might want to write lower. Okay, in the exercise one, it meant decreasing. This one, it just means lower. So why do you think that is? Why is the trained person's resting heart rate lower than the untrained person? Okay. We've learned about everything that affects your heart rate. So you can't just sit there and wait for me to give you the answer. I can guide you to it, but I'm hoping that it will spontaneously come to you. You already know, you knew before you came in here that a trained person has a lower resting heart rate than an untrained person. So now I'm asking you to think about why. Yes?
Is it because their heart beats more efficiently, like it pumps more blood with every beat?
Yes, absolutely yes. And I'm going to get to that one when we get to submax heart rate. But I'm talking about it from a different angle with resting heart rate. What controls the heart rate? And what does the SA node normally set your heart rate at? Okay, so let's say when you were untrained, your resting heart rate was 75. You're trained, maybe your resting heart rate is 65. What is causing the trained person's heart rate to be lower than the untrained person? What's happening to the parasympathetic nervous system?
Decreasing the activity.
Is it decreasing or increasing?
Increasing.
Remember, if the parasympathetic nervous system is active, what does that do to your heart rate? What does it do to your heart rate?
Increasing.
It decreases it. So if our heart rate is lower than it was, what happened to parasympathetic activity? We increased our parasympathetic activity. Specifically what? Increased vagal tone. Okay, so one of the adaptations to endurance training is your parasympathetic nervous system will become more active. You'll have increased vagal tone, which will cause your heart rate to be lower. Okay. We've learned this already, right? You guys have got to start pulling this out of your brain. As soon as I drew this, you guys knew where I was going. Okay? I need you to try to access it before I draw it. Okay? So resting heart rate is lower in a trained person because their parasympathetic nervous system is more active. The vagus nerve is more active. How about heart rate max? Trained person, how's a trained person's heart rate max compared to an untrained person's heart rate max? Higher, lower, or the same? Same, why?
Based on age.
Because it's a max.
Heart rate max is based on age. Okay, you can't just say because it's a max value, because all the other max values are going to be affected by training. But this one specifically is not affected by training because it depends on age. Yes?
Wouldn't it decrease, because if you're increasing age, you're decreasing your heart rate, your max as well.
What's happening to your age?
You're getting older.
Okay, yes. So, yeah, that was the next thing I was going to say, is you could argue if this person trained for a year, they're a year older, therefore their heart rate max is a little bit lower. So you could argue that. Okay, but generally, the heart rate max is not affected by training. Heart rate sub-max, I'm going to come back to. I'm going to skip that. Cardiac output, I'm going to come back to. I've got to do stroke volume before I do those. So, let's say stroke volume max. Trained person versus untrained person. How do you think the trained person's maximum stroke volume compares to the untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same? It's going to be higher. You just have a general sense it's going to be higher, right? Can you explain to me why it might be higher? Just throw out some ideas. Contractility, so maybe that ventricle will be able to squeeze harder, and in fact it can. One of the main adaptations to endurance training is that left ventricular myocardium actually gets thicker and stronger, so it can contract more forcefully. So if that contracts more forcefully, you can get more blood out. Very good. What else do you think?
Do you have less peripheral resistance?
Okay, they could have less resistance. We'll talk about how that would happen. So,
Increased instill? Oh,
the distensibility is not necessarily going to change, because the distensibility is the ability of the ventricle to stretch. It's not going to have more of an ability to stretch, but the size of the chamber of the ventricle itself is going to increase. So you'll actually have more space inside the ventricle as an adaptation to training. Okay? So you have to remember, if you're thinking about what's going to affect stroke volume, you have to think about it in terms of this. Right? We know stroke volume is going up, so what's going to happen to end diastolic volume?
increase.
What's going to happen to end systolic volume? We've seen this before. What goes here?
Finish return.
Increasing or decreasing?
Increase.
What goes here?
What's this stability?
Distensibility. What goes here?
Contractility.
Contractility.
And resistance.
What's happening to resistance?
Decrease.
Okay, so we drew this same thing for what happens to stroke volume with exercise. And we talked about what can increase venous return during exercise, what can increase all these things during exercise. Now we're talking about what's causing increases in stroke volume from training. So it's going to still go through these same pathways, because these are the things that can affect your stroke volume. But what's causing an increase in venous return and what's causing an increase in contractility will be different as a result of training than it was as a result of exercise intensity. Okay, so we already mentioned the main ones. So what were the two main adaptations we already talked about?
Contractility.
Contractility. So what was increasing the contractility?
The thickness of the left ventricular.
Left ventricular hypertrophy. Okay, that's a primary adaptation to endurance training. The ventricular wall gets more muscular. It can contract more forcefully. That causes an increase in stroke volume. Okay, which then in return leaves you with less blood inside the ventricle. what was the other one I said? What's happening to the inside of the ventricle?
It's more space.
Okay, where is that gonna go on here, do you think?
That's what I thought.
It's not gonna be distensibility, because the ventricle's not stretching,
So
it's just
resistance?
bigger.
Resistance?
It's not gonna be resistance, because resistance is what the heart is pushing against. We're talking about a bigger, more space inside the ventricle. You can fit more blood in there. If you can fit more blood in the ventricle, which of these is it going to affect? It's going to affect venous return. If one person has a small glass and one person has a large glass, and I ask you to go get me a glass of water, who can get me more water? Person with a larger glass can get me more water. The larger the capacity you have to carry blood, the more blood you're going to be able to put in there. Okay, so increased left ventricular internal diameter. Left ventricular internal diameter. There's more space inside the ventricle. That allows you to have more blood coming into the ventricle, increased venous return, increases your end diastolic volume, your preload, which causes an increase in stroke volume. Okay, so these are the two main adaptations I'm going to give you right now that will cause an increase in stroke volume max. In about a half hour, I'm going to add more detail to that. Okay, but this is the short form answer for why stroke volume max is increasing. Okay, increased left ventricular hypertrophy will increase contractility. Increased left ventricular internal diameter will increase venous return. Increase in diastolic volume. Okay, everybody okay with that? Could I put here muscle pump, skeletal muscle pump, respiratory pump, increasing venous return? Would those go here?
Yes.
Are those things increasing as a result of training? Or do those things increase as a result of increased exercise intensity? Okay, so you have to remember what we're talking about. Those things went here. When you increase your exercise intensity, you increase the activity of your skeletal muscle pump and your respiratory pump. That's not here right now because those are not adaptations to training. If you do endurance training for a year, that doesn't increase the efficiency of your muscle pump, but it does increase the size of your heart and the strength of your heart. Okay. So, let's do stroke volume submax. Trained person and untrained person, both jogging on the treadmill at 5 miles per hour. How does the trained person's stroke volume compare to the untrained person's stroke volume? Higher, lower, or the same? It should be higher. It's not a trick question, I promise.
Blue, please.
It's going to be higher. The trained person will have a higher submax stroke volume than the untrained person. Why do you think? Their heart is still bigger and stronger. These adaptations to training aren't just working at max. They're working at submax, they're working at rest. Stroke volume is going to be higher across the board because of these adaptations. So you can put the same thing, increased left ventricular hypertrophy, increased left ventricular internal diameter. This is what's making the heart more efficient. Let's do cardiac output max. How does a trained person's max cardiac output compare to an untrained person's max cardiac output? Higher, lower, or the same?
Increase or higher.
It's going to be higher. Why?
Because the heart's more efficient, it's able to pump out more blood.
Physiologically, yes, but use different terms.
Heart rate, stroke volume.
What does cardiac output depend on?
Heart rate.
Okay, so cardiac output max depends on heart rate max and stroke volume max. This is the best way to explain what's happening to cardiac output. What's happening to heart rate max with training?
This is.
Nothing. What's happening to stroke volume max with training?
Increases.
Increasing. So what's happening to cardiac output max? It's increasing. Why?
There's the increase in stroke volume.
Because of increases in stroke volume. Okay. Cardiac output submax. So you have a trained person and an untrained person, both jogging on the treadmill at 5 miles per hour. How does the trained person's cardiac output compare to the untrained person's cardiac output? Higher, lower, or the same? Higher, why? Well, the stroke volume will be higher, that's true. We haven't done heart rate yet. But, let me tell you this, important piece of information, okay? Any given intensity requires a given amount of oxygen consumption. So, someone who's jogging on a treadmill at 5 miles per hour is going to consume a certain amount of oxygen that is required to do that amount of work. It doesn't matter if you're trained or untrained. It doesn't matter if you weigh 250 pounds or 110 pounds. Jogging at 5 miles per hour requires a given amount of oxygen. How is it possible for me to say that a 250 pound person and a 110 pound person jogging at 5 miles per hour are going to consume the same amount of oxygen? How can I say that? How do we express oxygen consumption? In what units? How is it possible that the 250 pound person and the 110 pound person are consuming the same amount of oxygen? This takes into account their body weight, doesn't it? On a relative level, they're consuming the same amount of oxygen. On an absolute level, the bigger person is going to be consuming a ton more oxygen because they have more kilograms. But per kilogram of body weight, that exercise requires the same amount of oxygen. So, whether it doesn't matter if you're trained or untrained, let's say, for example, I don't know what the exact number is, I'd have to look it up. Let's just throw out a number to explain the concept. Jogging at 5 miles per hour, let's say, requires 25 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. Okay? It doesn't matter how much you weigh, it's still going to be 25 milliliters per kilogram. So the more you weigh, the more oxygen on an absolute level you're going to consume because you multiply your kilograms to get to liters. Okay? So it doesn't matter how fit this person is. Jogging at 5 miles per hour requires 25 milliliters per oxygen per kilogram per minute. It's going to feel harder to the untrained person because maybe the untrained person's max is 30 and the trained person's max is 45. So the untrained person is at a higher percentage of their max. It's going to feel harder. But it's the same amount of oxygen at that intensity. That kind of makes sense? That's kind of a hard concept to grasp. So if a given intensity requires a given amount of oxygen consumption, then the amount of oxygen that is delivered and consumed at a given intensity is going to be the same, whether you are trained, untrained, 200 pounds, 100 pounds, doesn't matter. 5 miles per hour is a given intensity. Okay, so knowing that, you have a trained person and an untrained person both jogging at 5 miles per hour. How is the trained person's cardiac output compared to the untrained person's cardiac output? It's the same. Why? I just explained it to you. Can you explain it back to me?
Requires the same amount of oxygen.
A given intensity requires a given amount of oxygen consumption. Another way we could explain that, what does cardiac output submax depend on? Heart rate submax, stroke volume submax. Okay, we know cardiac output submax is going to be the same. What's happening to stroke volume submax? It's increasing because of those changes in the heart. So what can happen to heart rate? The trained person, if the trained person and untrained person are both jogging at 5 miles per hour, how is the trained person's heart rate going to compare to the untrained person's heart rate?
Could be lower.
It's going to be lower. The submax heart rate of the trained person can be lower because their stroke volume is higher. So if their stroke volume is higher, their heart rate can be lower and still maintain the same cardiac output. The increases in stroke volume will maintain the cardiac output, so the heart rate can be lower. Okay, so an untrained person, their heart is smaller and weaker, so each time they contract, they're getting less blood out. So in order to deliver the amount of blood they need to run at 5 miles per hour, they have to contract really quickly. Okay, the trained person, their heart is bigger, it's stronger, so each time it contracts, it gets more blood out. So to deliver that same amount of oxygen, it can contract more slowly. Okay, so the untrained person's heart is doing this at 5 miles per hour, and the trained person's heart is doing this. Try that, it's kind of hard. They're delivering the same amount of blood. They're delivering the same amount of oxygen, but the trained person does it more efficiently because their stroke volume is higher. Their heart rate can be lower. Questions on that? So we've done all of these now, which is the entire first page, right? No, we haven't done AVO2. You ready for me to move on to AVO2?
I'm sorry, can you explain this, the heart rate submax one more time?
Yes, heart rate submax. A trained person's heart rate submax is lower than an untrained person because the stroke volume is higher to maintain their cardiac output. So you could write the same thing here. Cardiac output is maintained by a lower heart rate and a higher stroke volume. Increases in stroke volume help to maintain cardiac output. Okay, let's do AVO2 difference max. So is the trained person, what does AVO2 difference reflect again?
Blood or oxygen consumption.
Oxygen consumption by the muscle. Okay, so do you think a trained person will have a higher capacity to consume oxygen at their muscle than an untrained person?
Yes.
Yeah, this is going to be a major adaptation to training, your ability to consume oxygen. So AVO2 difference max is going to increase. What adaptations do you suppose are happening that will help you consume more oxygen at the muscle?
More mitochondria.
Yes. Increased number and size of mitochondria. Mitochondria is where you're consuming the oxygen. So if the mitochondria you have get bigger, then you have more ability to consume oxygen, and you grow more mitochondria. More ability to consume oxygen, more mitochondria you have. Good. What else?
Dense capillaries.
Increased capillary density and recruitment. So increased capillary density, you're actually growing new capillaries. And increased recruitment, you actually have, when you're not trained, you have capillaries that you're not using. So when you train, you'll not only grow new capillaries, but you'll start using capillaries that you weren't using before. How does that help you increase your AVO2 difference?
Delivering blood to the exercising muscle.
Yeah, you need the capillaries to deliver the blood. You need, remember we had the drawing of the muscle This is the capillary. This is the mitochondria. So the more capillaries you have, the more surface area you have where you're going to be diffusing oxygen. Right? What law is that? Fick's law. The rate of diffusion is directly related, it's proportional to surface area. So the more capillaries you have in contact with this muscle, the more oxygen you'll be able to diffuse there. So it's going to help you deliver oxygen. What else would help us here?
More red blood cells.
Red blood cells, yes. That goes here. I'm not going to put that here right now. I'm going to put it later.
How about myoglobin?
Myoglobin. Remember, it doesn't help us if these capillaries are dropping off oxygen and we've got all these mitochondria. It doesn't help us unless we have the myoglobin to deliver it. Okay, so all these things work together to help us consume more oxygen. And there's one more thing I'm going to add here for now, which is increased oxidative enzymes. Give me an example of some oxidative enzymes here in the mitochondria. Okay, isocitrate dehydrogenase. What else?
Oxidate.
Bam.
Use the Krebs cycle things.
Citrate substance.
Citrate synthase. Succinate dehydrogenase. Okay, so these are the Krebs cycle enzymes. What's the other important enzyme in the mitochondria?
It's oxidative substance.
Glucose 6-phosphatase.
Cytochrome.
Yeah, there it is.
Cytochrome oxidase. What is that the enzyme for?
Electron
Electron transport
Electron
chain.
transport chain.
So one of the adaptations to endurance training, you'll get more of these enzymes, and the enzymes will become more active. That makes all of these oxidative processes go faster, which means within that minute, because remember we measure VO2 per minute, you're going to be able to consume more oxygen. You've got more oxygen being delivered, the uptake, carrying it to the mitochondria, being consumed in the mitochondria, and the enzymes are helping that whole process go faster. Okay, so these are the 4 major adaptations that I'm going to put here for AVO2 difference. In a few minutes I will be adding more to that, but those are going to be the major ones for right now that are going to go in that box. AVO2 difference submax. Trained person, untrained person, both jogging on a treadmill at 5 miles per hour. How does the trained person's AVO2 difference compare to the untrained person's AVO2 difference? Higher, lower, or the same?
Higher.
Higher, why?
Is all those things.
Well, all those adaptations are still there, but just because you have the capacity to consume 60 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute, does that mean you're always going to do it? Whether you're at rest, sub-max exercise, max exercise, you're always consuming your maximum amount of oxygen? Or are you only going to consume the amount of oxygen you need for your given intensity? So, trained person, how is a trained person's AVO2 difference going to compare to the untrained person's AVO2 difference if they're both running at 5 miles per hour? It's going to be the same. Why? Because any given intensity requires a given amount of oxygen. So they're only going to consume the amount of oxygen that's required for that activity. Good. Okay, now we're turning the page. I'm going to do the VO2s last. Lactate threshold. How does a trained person's lactate threshold compare to the untrained person's lactate threshold? Higher, lower, or the same?
Higher.
Higher. Why?
More bicarbonate buffer.
Okay. So, here's the thing with the bicarbonate buffer. You increase your bicarbonate buffer by doing interval training. This table is specifically referring to adaptations from endurance training. So endurance training will not increase your bicarbonate buffer. So then the question becomes, will endurance training cause an increase in your lactate threshold? Yes? Okay. How? The answer is yes, you're right.
If you want to
How?
have more mitochondria, you will have more cap with the same.
Exactly. If you remember, the reason why we were producing so much lactic acid is our mitochondria got overloaded, right? And we had to overflow with those electron carriers, had to overflow and create lactic acid. So when you do endurance training, you have more mitochondria. So you have more space in there to consume oxygen. So maybe before you trained at 5 miles per hour, your mitochondria was overloaded, you were producing lactic acid and you were passing your lactate threshold. But after you've trained, now you have more mitochondria, they're bigger, you have more capillaries, you have more myoglobin. So this whole process of consuming oxygen is more efficient. So now at 5 miles per hour, you still have space in your mitochondria, you're not overflowing into lactic acid. So you're producing less lactic acid because of these adaptations that are increasing your ability to consume oxygen. Okay, so there are basically two ways you can increase your lactate threshold. You can either increase lactate clearance, or you can decrease lactate production. Okay, both of those would increase your lactate threshold. You increase lactate clearance through the buffer, which comes from endurance training, which comes from interval training, which we're going to talk about a different day. Okay, you decrease lactate production by being able to stay in your aerobic system at higher intensities because of these adaptations to endurance training. So that means if you have someone with a goal of increasing their lactate threshold, right, maybe they've met their capacity of increasing their VO2 max, so the next thing they want to do is increase their lactate threshold. Should they just be doing interval training? Should they just be doing endurance training? Or should they be doing both? It's like saying you have someone who's trying to lose weight, well, should they move more or should they eat less? Either one is going to help, right? But it would be most beneficial and most effective if they did both, because they're having an effect on that from different angles. Okay, so same thing here. If you're trying to increase your lactate threshold, you want to do a combination of interval training and endurance training because they cause increases in your lactate threshold through different pathways. Good? Okay. Blood pH. Trained person, untrained person, jogging at 5 miles per hour. How does the trained person's blood pH compare to the untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same?
The same.
I'm hearing some answers, but they don't sound very confident.
Higher.
Higher, yes. Why?
Because you have
Let's
less
say there's
Their lactate threshold is higher. So at any given intensity, they're going to be producing less lactate because they haven't reached their lactate threshold. So at 5 miles per hour, the untrained person might be above their lactate threshold, producing a ton of lactic acid, their pH is dropping. The trained person has a higher lactate threshold, so they're not going to be producing as much lactic acid at that intensity. So their pH will be higher. Remember, the more lactic acid you have, the lower your pH. Lactate production is lower at the same intensity, yes. Okay, plasma volume.
Increase.
Plasma volume will increase, yes. This is actually the first adaptation you'll get with training. It's the first one you'll lose if you stop training, and it's the first one you'll get when you start training. Plasma volume will increase. It's kind of a two-step process. So the first thing that happens is you'll increase albumin. What was happening to plasma volume as exercise intensity increased? It was decreasing, why? Sweat and
Going back into the muscle.
fluid going into the muscle. Okay, so albumin is a protein in your blood that prevents plasma from going into your muscle. So that's going to come across as an increase in plasma because you're not losing as much into the muscle. The next thing that will happen is you will get an increase in ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone. What's a diuretic?
It makes you pee a lot more.
Yes, a diuretic increases urine production. So what would an antidiuretic do? Decrease urine production. So antidiuretic hormone is going to decrease urine production, which is going to come across to you as an increase in plasma volume. Because you won't be losing as much. Antidiuretic hormone will decrease urine production. That will increase plasma levels. Red blood cells. What happens to red blood cell count with endurance training? It will increase. As far as why, you can really just put your body produces more red blood cells. It's because of erythropoietin, but I'm not going to require you to know that. Just know that your body produces more red blood cells. So, what then happens to hematocrit? If we have plasma increasing and red blood cells increasing, remind me again what hematocrit is. Ratio of 4 milliments to total blood volume. So you think if red blood cells and plasma are both increasing, if they're increasing the same amount, what would happen to hematocrit? It would stay the same. But that's not what's happening. What would happen if you were to increase red blood cells without increasing plasma? We talked about this when we talked about blood. What would happen if you increase red blood cells only? It would increase hematocrit. It would also increase your oxygen carrying capacity, right? So it would have the benefit of increasing your oxygen carrying capacity, but it would have the detriment of increasing your viscosity. Okay, so the adaptations to training always seem to be things that help us somehow. Okay, you're not going to adapt by things that are going to get in your way. So it's going to help you, give you more red blood cells so you can carry more oxygen, but in order for us to benefit from that, we have to increase plasma enough so that hematocrit will go down, so that our viscosity can go down. So we get the benefit of the increased oxygen carrying capacity without increasing our resistance. So hematocrit will go down because the increases in plasma are larger than the increases in red blood cells. Yes, what was I talking about? Hematocrit. A trained person's hematocrit will be lower because the increases in plasma volume are larger than the increases in red blood cell. Okay, next one is blood pressure. If you have a trained person and an untrained person, both jogging at 5 miles per hour, how does the trained person's blood pressure compare to the untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same?
Lower.
Okay, so if the person was hypertensive to begin with, and they go through the process of training, then it's possible that their blood pressure could be lower. If the person had normal blood pressure to begin with, then their blood pressure is not going to be affected by training. Because it's normal for your blood pressure to increase during exercise. If you have normal blood pressure, that's not going to be affected by training. Okay, so you can just say, if the person was hypertensive to begin with, then submax blood pressure would be lower. If the person had normal blood pressure to begin with, then it would be unchanged as a result of training. We're not gonna go into the details and mechanics of why. We're just gonna leave it at that.
One more time.
Yes, if the person is hypertensive to begin with, then after training, their submax blood pressure would be lower, could be lower. But for someone with normal blood pressure to begin with, their training blood pressure should be about the same. Trained blood pressure. Yes, Jay?
So this is submax, you training the blood pressure?
Submax. Submax blood pressure is the only one I have on here. And it's specifically referring to systolic blood pressure as well. Other questions? Wanna move on?
What was the second part?
Second reason for the blood pressure, I said if the person has normal blood pressure to begin with, then blood pressure wouldn't be affected by training. Okay, RER. Trained person, untrained person, both jogging at 5 miles per hour. How does the trained person's RER compare to the untrained person's RER? Higher, lower, or the same? Lower, why?
Producing less lactic acid, less non-metabolic CO2.
Yes, but can we be a little more specific, Jay?
Use less like carbohydrates and.
Right, what does RER reflect?
They exchange
It's the substrate utilization, right? It's not lactic acid, it's the substrate utilization. So the higher the intensity, the more you have to rely on carbohydrates. The more you go into your anaerobic system, the more you have to rely on carbohydrates, which makes the RER go up. Okay? The trained person at that same intensity, because they have a higher lactate threshold, is still aerobic, so they can still be burning a combination of fat and carbohydrates. Whereas the untrained person maybe has passed their lactate threshold, so they're relying more on their anaerobic systems, which means they have to be relying more on carbohydrates. Okay, so a trained person will have a lower RER at a given intensity because they can still rely on fat as a substrate. Because their lactate threshold is higher because of all these adaptations. These adaptations are going to be the cause of a lot of things. Okay, all we have left is VO2, right? Max and submax. Okay, and we have a half hour here. Okay, let's start with VO2 submax. Trained person and untrained person, both jogging at 5 miles per hour on the treadmill. How does a trained person's, what does VO2 refer to? Oxygen consumption. Okay, so how does a trained person's oxygen consumption compare to the untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same? I'm getting some higher, some lower, and some the same. Why would it be higher?
It depends on
So our,
Given intensity. Given amount of oxygen.
It should be the same.
should be the same. Cause like,
Jay, go ahead.
Is it just like the intensity is the same as the.
Yeah, if they're both jogging at 5 miles per hour, we already said that requires the same amount of oxygen. So the trained person might have a higher maximum capacity to consume oxygen, which we're gonna get to in a minute, but they don't need to. At 5 miles per hour, they're just gonna consume the amount of oxygen they need to exercise at that intensity. So it's gonna be the same. Okay, another way to look at that, what does VO2 submax depend on? Heart rate submax. Submax. happening to heart rate submax? Trained person versus untrained.
It's decreasing.
It was lower. The trained person has a lower heart rate. What about stroke volume? Higher stroke volume, and what did that do to cardiac output?
Increase.
No,
Oh,
keep it the same.
Submax was the same. AVO2 difference submax was what? The same. Okay, so VO2 submax is the same, trained versus untrained, because cardiac output is the same and AVO2 difference is the same. Because any given intensity requires a given amount of oxygen consumption. Okay, let's do max. So don't erase yours, rewrite yours. Give yourself a whole page for this one. So VO2 max equals heart rate max and stroke volume max times AVO2 difference max. Okay, without even doing those, what do we know is going to happen to VO2 max? With training? Increase. That's one of the main reasons you do endurance training, is to increase your VO2 max. It's the main adaptation. Okay, but how is that happening? What's happening to heart rate max? Staying the same, except for the aging you might do. What's happening to stroke volume max? Increasing. So what's happening to cardiac output max? Increase because of the increases in stroke volume. What happened to AVO2 difference max? It increased. Okay, so VO2 max increases with endurance training because cardiac output max increases, mainly due to increases in stroke volume, and AVO2 difference max increases. Okay, so let's go back and add the details for what's causing the increases in these. Okay, what did we say were the causes in the increase in stroke volume max?
Increase in internal,
Increased
left ventricle internal diameter,
internal diameter and
hypertrophy.
the hypertrophy is going to cause the contractility. So the hypertrophy is the primary adaptation. Contractility is the secondary adaptation. That would lead to increases in stroke volume, would lead to increases in cardiac output, and lead to increases in VO2 max. Okay, what did we say were the causes of the increase in AVO2 difference max?
Mitochondria number and size.
Number and size, mitochondria. What else?
Capillaries.
Capillary density and recruitment. What else?
Myoglobin.
And,
Oxidative enzymes.
okay. So those are the main ones. I'm going to add a few more. I'm going to say that an increase in red blood cell count would help you increase your AVO2 difference. How do you think that would happen?
More oxygen to the exercise muscle.
Yeah, the more red blood cells you have, the more it increases your oxygen carrying capacity, right? The more oxygen you can carry, the more oxygen you can deliver. The more you deliver, you can more uptake and consume. So that's going to increase your AVO2 difference. I'm going to say that an increased plasma volume will also help increase your AVO2 difference? How do you think that works? How can an increased plasma volume cause an increase in your AVO2 difference?
What,
I'm sorry?
What?
Less, I'm
Because
sorry.
the hormone AGE.
Okay, so the antidiuretic hormone is what's causing the increase in plasma volume. I want to know how the increased plasma volume is causing an increase in AVO2 difference.
More oxidative enzymes.
Decrease.
Well, that's here. That's a separate adaptation.
Because you can turn more red blood cells, you can have more red blood cells.
Well, that's this one. So how is the plasma volume itself going to help us?
Because of more fluid?
Total blood volume.
Okay, so I heard total blood volume. So an increase in plasma is going to increase total blood volume, right? How is total blood volume going to help us increase our AVO2 difference?
More portion of red blood cells. The red blood cell count will increase as well after plasma increases.
Well, these are happening separately. These are two separate adaptations. The more blood you have, let's say one person has 4 liters of blood and one person has 5 liters of blood. The person that has more blood is going to have more blood passing by their muscle. The more blood you have passing through the muscle, the more opportunities you have to drop off oxygen. So it's just going to increase blood flow to the muscle. The more blood you have, the more blood you have flowing through the muscle. Okay? So, but plasma volume, the red blood cells also increase blood volume, right? So these two together will increase total blood volume, which is going to help us increase our AVO2 difference just by increasing blood flow to the muscle. So that means red blood cells are helping us in 2 different ways, right? They're helping us by increasing our oxygen carrying capacity, delivery, uptake, consumption. It's also helping us by increasing total blood volume, which increases blood flow, which increases delivery, uptake, and consumption also. Plasma volume has another way it's going to help, besides increasing total blood volume. I heard someone whisper it.
The viscosity?
What's it going to do to viscosity?
Decrease.
Decrease. So what's it going to do to hematocrit?
Decrease.
So it's going to decrease hematocrit, which is going to decrease viscosity. How is that going to help us?
Increase in less resistance.
Okay. Less resistance, yes. But that resistance is not going to affect AVO2 difference. That resistance is going to affect stroke volume. But how is the decreased viscosity going to increase our AVO2 difference?
Your blood flows.
It's going to increase your blood flow. Makes it easier for the blood to flow, right? To get more blood. The more blood you have flowing to the muscles, the better. I have one more adaptation to add here, and that is arterial autoregulation. With endurance training, your body gets better, more efficient at arterial autoregulation. What does that mean to you? Increased vasodilation at the muscle, which will help you How is vasodilation going to help us increase our AVO2 difference?
More oxygen being
It's going to increase blood flow. The more blood you have flowing through the muscle, the more opportunities you have to pick up and consume oxygen. Okay, I know you want to say something about resistance here. That's happening also, but that resistance is not going to affect AVO2 difference. It's going to affect stroke volume, which means I need to put that over here as well. Okay, so I'm going to put over here the increased red blood cells and the increased plasma together will increase total blood volume. How will that help us increase our stroke volume?
Higher diastolic rate.
More blood you have in your body, the more blood you can return to your heart. The more you can preload it with, the more you can pump out. How else is plasma going to help? We just talked about it over there. What you desperately wanted to say.
Resistance.
It's going to decrease hematocrit, which is going to decrease viscosity, which is going to decrease resistance. So this means the red blood cells are helping us in 3 different ways. It's going to help us by increasing our oxygen carrying capacity, which is going to lead to AVO2 difference. It's also going to help us increase our total blood volume, which is going to lead to increased AVO2 difference. And that increased blood volume is also going to help us increase our stroke volume. Same thing for plasma. It's on both sides, has multiple pathways. Okay, one more I'm going to add here is increased arterial regulation. How will that help us increase our stroke volume? I already mentioned it.
Vasodilation.
Okay, so that vasodilation is going to cause what?
Blood flow.
Well, the blood flow is going to help us with AVO2 difference. Blood flow is not going to help us with stroke volume. So if you try to memorize this stuff, it's going to drive you insane because there's so much overlap. So how many unique primary adaptations did I give you? How many unique primary adaptations did I give you? The primary adaptations are in red.
LVID.
Unique just means not repeated. One, two, seven. Why am I not numbering these? Because they're repeated. Okay, so I gave you 9 unique primary adaptations to endurance training. By the way, there are 12, but I'm only giving you 9. You're welcome. You have to know these 9. Like, you should be able to rattle them off. I'm going to ask you 20 times between now and your final to list those for me. And you should be able to just rattle off all 9, no problem. Okay, you need to know those 9 primary adaptations. You need to be able to take each one and explain in detail how it causes an increase in VO2 max. Some of them are very simple and direct. Some of them have a lot of pathways. Okay, something like left ventricular hypertrophy. Let's throw that one out. I'll do a couple of examples. So I'm going to draw it as a vertical map, because that's the way we've been doing it, but you could also write it horizontally. This leads to this, leads to this, if you wanted to. Okay, I'm going to draw it vertically, because that's the way we've been doing it. So I'm going to say increase left ventricular hypertrophy Okay, this would be endurance training, the top, okay, causes left ventricular hypertrophy. How is that gonna get us to increase VO2 max? What do I put here?
Increase in, myocardio, constriction strength.
Increase contract
Yeah, you have to, when you're doing this, think back to this. Right, which pathway was hypertrophy taking us through? It was taking us through the contractility, right, to lead to stroke volume. Okay, so increased left ventricular hypertrophy caused an increase in contractility, which caused what? An increase in stroke volume, which caused
Increase in, cardiac output.
increased cardiac output, which takes us to increased VO2 max. Okay, that one's pretty simple. Let's do increased left ventricular internal diameter. How does that help us? Increasing venous return, which would increase
Diastolic.
how does that help us?
Decrease in heart rate. Oh, no, stroke.
Okay, that one's also pretty straightforward. Let's do a straightforward one for AVO2 difference. You guys ready for me to erase this? Let's do increased capillary density and recruitment. How is that gonna help us? All you really need to do is get us from capillary density to AVO2 difference. Because once we get to AVO2 difference, you go directly to VO2 max. So what I'm really asking you to explain, how does capillary density help you get an increased AVO2 difference?
Increase.
Say it a little louder so I can hear you.
Increase blood flow.
Say it for blood flow?
Yes, it's going to increase blood flow. Think about it in terms of the oxygen delivery and uptake part. So we need the capillaries.
Increase red blood cells.
Increased capillary density does not cause an increase in red blood cells. Those are two separate adaptations.
So,
What do we say about if this is the muscle? What's the benefit? If you're untrained, you just have this. If you're trained, you have this.
More oxygen.
What's the benefit?
surface.
Surface area. That's going to give you an increased oxygen diffusion rate, right? So we can just say increased oxygen delivery and uptake. Once we get to an increase, if we can explain an increased oxygen delivery and uptake, that's increased AVO2 difference. So once we can say that, we can go straight to increased VO2 max. Okay, before we run out of time, I'm going to do a more complicated one. Okay? to increased red blood cells. Okay, now you might not wanna write this one down exactly as we're going along because we're gonna think it through. So the first things we think might not be right, we might end up changing it. So just keep that in mind, at least write it in pencil. Okay, so how many different ways are the red blood cells helping us?
3. It's oxygen carrying capacity, total blood volume, and increasing stroke volume max.
Okay, so it's helping us, we're gonna end up going through these two main pathways, right? It's gonna help us through AVO2 difference and through stroke volume. So we know we're gonna end up with two different things coming in. But red blood cells are increasing AVO2 difference in two different ways. And one of those ways is the same as the way it's increasing stroke volume. Okay, so we have to figure out how many branches we're gonna put here. If we start out wrong, it's okay, we can always fix it. How many branches are we gonna start with?
2.
I'm hearing 3 and I'm hearing 2.
2.
Okay, what are the 2?
Oxygen carrying capacity and total blood volume.
Increased oxygen carrying capacity and increased total blood volume. Okay, those people that wanted a third, what would the third be? Or is everybody okay with this? Okay, because the blood volume is going to help us in two ways. So we could do a third leg with blood volume and have it go through a different pathway, but we don't need to, right? We can split this, right? Okay. Let's do oxygen carrying capacity first. How does that help us?
More oxygen delivered.
Increase oxygen delivery and uptake. And I said once you get that, you're golden. You've got AVO2 difference, which is going to take us to increase VO2 max, which is the goal. What are these going to be? Well, we know that these are the two different total blood volume pathways, right? One is going to lead us to AVO2 difference, and one is going to lead us to stroke volume. So does it matter which one I put where?
Yes.
Why?
So you don't overlap.
I don't want to overlap, and I don't want to have to draw a separate one. If I know one is going to lead me to this same pathway somewhere, I want to put that one here.
So that's for AVO2 difference.
Okay, so how is total blood volume going to help me get to AVO2 difference?
Blood flow?
Decrease max.
The total blood volume is not decreasing the hematocrit. The plasma is decreasing the hematocrit.
What was it? Increase of the
Increased. I can't hear you. How does having more blood help us consume more oxygen at the muscle?
Get them out. Blood flow.
Blood flow. The more blood you have flowing past the muscle, the more opportunities you have to pick up oxygen. So an increased total blood volume is going to increase blood flow to the muscle, which is going to do what? Increase oxygen delivery and uptake, which is going to increase our ability to consume oxygen. Okay, what's our other pathway for total blood volume? This one's got to take us to stroke volume. So how is increased blood volume help us increase our stroke volume?
Increase
Increasing venous return, which does what?
Increase intestinal volume.
Increase stroke volume. Increase VO2. Okay.
Good. The plasma volume one is a little more complicated than this one. Because it has 2 reasons for each. Okay, so what I'd like you to do, today's Tuesday, so you have homework between now and Thursday. I want you to go through and try to draw a map like this for each of the 9 primary adaptations. Okay, most of them are straightforward. It's the red blood cells, the plasma, and the arterial autoregulation that are more complex because they overlap. I want you to do your best to try and draw those maps on your own. Okay, think it through logically, and then we'll go over them on Thursday.
Alrighty.